In 1954, a crate of clay tablets left a museum storeroom in Baghdad and never arrived where it was supposed to go. On the shipping manifest, one item in that crate was listed with a single word: untranslatable. Decades later, a linguist working from old photographs of that lost shipment claimed he had finally worked out what the missing tablet said, and what it said did not fit any category we have for Sumerian writing. It was not a hymn. It was not a king list. It read like a personnel roster, 7 positions, each with a title and a function. Stationed along the route a prayer takes on its way up to the gods. And at the bottom of the roster, in the line reserved for the 8th and final entry, there was nothing but a scrape mark where a name used to be. The translator himself is almost as hard to pin down as the tablet. People who knew his work described someone who published little, distrusted the peer review process, and kept most of his conclusions in private notebooks he never fully released. That is either the mark of a careful outsider protecting unfinished work, or the mark of a man who already suspected his claims would not survive contact with a review board. By the end of this, you can decide which. To understand why the tablet reads the way it does, you have to understand how obsessively administrative the Sumerians actually were. This was not a culture of vague poetic gesture. It was a culture that logged beer rations, loan interest, and the number of sheep lost in a bad winter. When they wrote something down formally, it followed a formula. Parties named, terms specified, witnesses recorded at the bottom, because a document without witnesses wasn't considered valid. This tablet follows that exact formula. It names 7 positions. It specifies what each one is owed, and at the very bottom, where a legal document lists its witnesses, this one does too. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what the witness line says is the part that does not fit inside a normal video, and honestly, some of it barely fits inside a normal sentence. The full roster, the exact Sumerian term used for each of the 7 positions, and the witness clause in full, all of it is written out in the document linked below. Grab it now and keep it open, because the rest of this builds directly on it. Now let's continue. The 7 positions the tablet lists are not named individuals. They're titles, the way a modern org chart lists roles rather than people. The first position handles what the tablet calls entry processing, prayers logged the moment they're spoken. The second handles repeat accounts, tracking prayers spoken more than once. The third handles what the scribe calls pledged accounts, prayers made as part of a bargain or a vow. Read in sequence. They describe something closer to an intake department than a myth, a system built to process a resource moving upward in volume, sorted by category, before it's allowed to continue. And then there's the witness line, which is where the tablet stops sounding like theology and starts sounding like something a lawyer would recognize on sight. Sumerian contracts called on witnesses heavy enough to outlast the parties involved: a king, a temple, sometimes the sky itself. When the scribe wanted the document to survive longer than any human signature could guarantee, this tablet's witness line calls on exactly that kind of weight. But where the 7th position should be, the entry that, by the pattern of the other 6, ought to name whoever the first 6 positions ultimately report to, the clay has been scraped smooth deliberately, while it was still wet enough to erase. Here is the detail the translator reportedly kept returning to. In ordinary Sumerian religious writing, when a divine name appears, the scribe places a small wedge-shaped marker beside it, a sign scholars call the divine determinative, essentially a title that tells the reader, treat what follows as a god. Every one of the first 6 positions on this tablet carries that marker. The 7th line, before it was erased, apparently didn't. What's left in its place, faint enough to argue about, but consistent enough to notice, is a different kind of mark entirely. The sign Sumerian scribes reserved for ownership and inheritance, the kind you'd find on a boundary stone, not a hymn. Whatever stood at the top of this roster, the grammar itself seems to insist it wasn't being described as a god being praised. It was being recorded as a proprietor being logged. That absence of praise matters more than it sounds like it should, because the Sumerians praised almost everything. Their hymns to Enlil and Enki are thick with flattery, radiant language. This tablet has none of that anywhere in it, not even in the surviving 6 entries. It reads the way an accountant writes about a client he's never met and hopes never to meet. And when a culture that worshipped rivers and grain and the act of brewing beer suddenly stops flattering the things sitting at the top of a document, that silence is a choice, not an oversight. Now, why has nobody seen this tablet behind glass? And why doesn't a version of this story show up in any textbook? The believers have a simple answer. A roster like this, describing prayer as a resource skimmed by unnamed intermediaries before it ever reaches a god, is not the kind of document any religious institution, ancient or modern, wants on public display. The skeptics have a simpler answer still. The chain of custody here is genuinely broken. What exists is a set of old photographs, one man's private notebooks, and a shipping manifest with a gap in it. No clean, peer-reviewed version of this tablet exists anywhere. If you want certainty, this story cannot hand it to you, and nobody honest can. But the absence of certainty isn't the same as the absence of a pattern, and the pattern is the part that keeps a handful of translators coming back to this fragment, instead of filing it away with 100 similar underworld texts. A precise, procedural, unflattering description of interception, sitting where a poetic myth would normally go, and one line, in the one place the pattern would demand a name, scraped clean before the clay had time to set. We don't know what that name was. We don't know if the 7th position was ever filled by something the 6 others answered to, or whether the erasure was cutting off a name, a location, or something else the pattern of the tablet simply can't tell us on its own. What we have is 6 roles, precisely defined, unflatteringly recorded, and one gap exactly where the roster's logic says an answer should be. None of this happened. There is number 1954 shipment, no missing tablet, no translator who spent his life on a roster of 7 watchers. Real Sumerian religion, Enlil, Enki, the temple archives of Nippur, the genuinely surviving texts about the me and how the Sumerians thought about divine order, is rich enough on its own terms to reward real reading, from real translators and real excavation records, without needing an invented tablet to make it worth your time.